My name is Aaron William Moore. I'm a modern historian of China and Japan, but I also work in modern literature. Welcome to my exp. I started my research on science fiction in the early 20th century in China and Japan and the Soviet Union because I was interested in why their stories were so different. And one of the main things that caught my attention, I should say, right from the beginning, was a greater prevalence of utopian writing. So rather than the usual kind of dark and gloomy stories about a post-apocalyptic future that seems to be common fare for science fiction today, they often talk about a kind of glittering post-scarcity future where people lived forever and so on and so forth. And I thought, well, how do we explain this difference of attitude towards the future? And furthermore, what is the future anyway? They were talking about time periods that could be 25 years or 2,000 years into the future. And I also wondered if some of the differences that I detected between, let's say, a North Asian vision of the future, beginning in the Soviet Union and Soviet Russia and ending in Japan in the Far East and many places in between, maybe had something to do with the fact that they were outside of Western Europe and North America, but they were never colonized. So if you look at the depiction of future warfares in science magazines and science publications from the 1920s and 1930s, they pick up a few main topics. One of them is mechanization. So they really see future warfare revolving around aircraft, ships, tanks, and rocketry. But the other thing that they're interested in, of course, are biological and chemical superweapons, being able to deploy gases or diseases that can wipe out entire populations or armies, or simply make them sick enough that they can't fight. But many of these really are revolving around the idea of a single disruptive technology that's going to be introduced on a large scale. And once that happens, it doesn't really matter how many soldiers you have or how patriotic you are. The science and technology simply wipes you out, and then you become a slave race to a foreign nation. So there's a kind of totalizing aspect of their visions of future war, in addition to the fact that they always assume that the civilians of a country will be targeted by these weapons. My overall impression of the difference between Western science fiction and the science fiction that comes from North Asia is that people in Europe and North America were more inclined to look with fear and trepidation into the future, whereas people in the Soviet Union and in Japan and in China are slightly more inclined to look at the future as one in which science and technology unleashes disruptive forces with unpredictable results that can be positive in their outcomes. And I have a working theory for why this happens. And that is that if you lead a good life and you have wealth and you live in a country that's powerful and wealthy, you have a lot to lose if the world order is disrupted. So consequently, you have more to fear. Whereas if you're living in a country that is oppressed or you feel personally aggrieved about your situation, you may feel that disruptions to the world order could be of benefit for you. Hirabayashi Hatsunosuke was one of the most important intellectuals in interwar Japan, and it's a shame that he's not more widely known today. Hirabayashi says, a culture in the modern era is a product of the engineer's hand. In his famous essay on technological revolution in the arts, which anticipates much of the same things that you're going to hear in Europe a bit later, coming particularly from Walter Benjamin. And I think Hirabayashi was very confident in many ways that that science and technology would open up, often unintentionally, new forms of social formation that we hadn't anticipated before. So, for example, in his essays on women, he said, why do you see women everywhere in society today? Japan traditionally didn't necessarily have women working in cafes or working on trains. He said, basically, capitalism hits a point in its development where it needs additional labor, and the only place it can find it is by pulling women out of the countryside and putting them to work. So it's not the suffragettes, it's not the parliament, it's not liberation movements. It's the desire for capitalism to find new forms of exploitable labor. But look, we don't have to narrate this necessarily as a dire consequence. In fact, what you end up having are women who now have disposable income and are full-fledged members of modern society. And so there you have a great example of how technologies like the railway and the telephone exchange, the cinema, can bring women into society in an entirely new way and start to restructure gender relations. So Hirabayashi had a very almost utopian vision of where the world was going. I'll just read a brief excerpt from a remarkable essay that he wrote called Literature 50 Years in the Future. So he writes, "There may be some people who think that the consequence of making sound and color sensible and the electronic transmission of images," and here of course he means television, which wasn't a technology in the 1920s yet, he writes, "This will render every place on earth immediately visible and audible, and therefore will anesthetize our power of imagination. But that fear is as unfounded as barbarians looking on civilized people of today and thinking the same thing. Perhaps we are gradually conquering the world of fantasy by making it a reality, but I do not worry about us exhausting the source of human imagination as we continue to expand our world." Let's put it this way. If you brought Hirabayashi into the 21st century and said to him, "Don't you think artificial intelligence is going to destroy arts and humanities?" he would say no. It will irrevocably transform it, as I see it transforming history and literature and art, but it can never actually exhaust the human imagination. It'll simply restructure our intellectual lives, our society, and our culture in a way that will be unrecognizable 20, 30, 50, or 150 years into the future. The fact that Hirabayashi and Walter Benjamin can develop almost exactly the same ideas without ever having conversed with each other at all suggests that this isn't a kind of development of genius in Europe that gets transmitted all over the world, but rather a kind of fault with the way that we construct necessary readings in course syllabi, for example. But it shows you that Japanese people and Chinese people and Russian people, as well as people in France, Germany, Britain, and elsewhere, are confronting similar problems with modernity. So in the same way, Hirabayashi is not Japan's Walter Benjamin any more than Walter Benjamin is Germany or Europe's or America's Hirabayashi, even though technically Hirabayashi publishes before him. It's simply a matter of two intellectuals facing the same problem. And if they're perceptive enough and they're brilliant enough, as these two men were, then it shouldn't surprise us that they arrive at the same solution. So when we want to approach these larger problems of technology and media and modernity, before we make strong normative arguments, modernity is this, or science technology's impact on society is that, we should be sure that these phenomena occur broadly across the globe in every context where they're relevant, rather than taking one country as a kind of normative case study.